Hello everyone, this is the review video for our evolution exam tomorrow. We're going to cover 3 domains and 6 kingdoms. We already did that in class today, but we'll also talk about cladograms as well as what we learned in class in the past 2 days as well. So we're going to first get started with the 3 domains. I'm just going to go over these real quick just in case you didn't get the answers down during class today. So what are the 3 domains of life? What are some characteristics of each domain? Basically, all you have to do is to memorize this chart. So keep this chart in mind. The 3 domains, if you look on this chart, the 3 domains are bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. And the 6th kingdom, you have eubacteria. So under the domain bacteria, all of eubacteria are the kingdoms. And archaea bacteria is under the domain archaea, and archaea bacteria is a kingdom. Under eukarya, there are 4 different kingdoms: protista, fungi, plantae, and animalia. Okay, so you might see a question asking you, what is the kingdom for bacteria? Then you would answer eubacteria. What is the kingdom for the domain archaea? You would answer archaea bacteria. What are the 4 kingdoms that falls under eukarya? It will be these 4. The next one is, what are some characteristics of each one? So first out, you have to know the difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. By this point, you have to know this. Prokaryotes are organisms that don't have a nucleus. They have DNA, but the DNA is not surrounded by a nucleus. So both bacteria and archaea, or in terms of kingdom, both eubacteria and archaea bacteria are prokaryotes. They do not have a nucleus. These two kingdoms also have only unicellular organisms. So they're both prokaryotes and only unicellular organisms. They both can be autotroph or heterotroph, as you can see over here. That's pretty much all you have to know. And the last one is they both have cell walls. So they're pretty similar, except archaea is the one that lives in most extreme, that are able to live in most extreme environment, and bacteria and eukarya usually can't live in those under those extreme conditions. The next one is a eukarya. We have these 4 categories. Protista is mostly unicellular, some multicellular, autotroph or heterotroph. Fungi is heterotroph only, and fungi can be multicellular or unicellular. And plants is all autotroph. So if a question asks you which of the following is an autotroph, it will be this one, archaea, and bacteria. But if the question asks you which of the following is a prokaryote that can be an autotroph, you can only answer bacteria or archaea, right? Because all 4 of these are under the domain eukarya. That means all 4 of these kingdoms contain organisms that have a true nucleus. So when you read the question, make sure you read it very carefully. The next one is animalia. Animalia is all heterotrophs, and they're all multicellular, and they do not have a cell wall. So everything can have a cell wall except animalia. The next question is, which domain contains organisms with no nucleus, bacteria and archaea? Which domain contains organisms with a true nucleus and nuclear membrane? That's all of the eukarya. Okay, next one. Which domain contains single-celled organisms, or you can call that unicellular? That would be bacteria and archaea. Which domain contains single-celled or multicellular organisms? That will be protista, fungi, and plantae. And the next one is, do all bacteria need oxygen to survive? The answer is no. Some bacteria do not need oxygen. Next one, do bacteria have cell membranes? Yes, everything has cell membranes. Bacteria is a decomposer. So remember this, bacteria is a decomposer. Fungi can also be a decomposer. However, a bacteria is a prokaryote and a fungi is a eukaryote. And Which domain lives in an extreme environment? That will be archaea. Next one, what does autotroph mean for an organism? We've talked about it a billion times. Autotrophs can make their own food. Heterotrophs have to eat other food in order to provide energy for itself. Are protists autotrophs, heterotrophs, or both? If you look on the chart, protists are both. And are fungi autotrophs, heterotrophs, or both? It says only heterotroph, so only heterotroph right here. What is an example of a fungi? Mushrooms. Are plants autotrophs? Plants are always autotrophs. Do plant cells have cell walls? Yes. Are all animals multicellular? Yes. Okay, now we can move on to evolution part 6, which was about cladograms. So for cladograms, for the most part, you just need to know how to read it, but you have to read it the right way in order to answer a question correctly. So first off, what is a cladogram? A cladogram is basically a family tree quote unquote, for evolution. You're able to tell the evolutionary relationship between different organisms. So that's a cladogram. And you can tell which organism is more closely related to a different organism. And how do you make a cladogram? Nowadays, scientists use DNA data in order to find out which two species are more closely related to each other and which species are less related to each other, because you can compare the DNA sequence and see how different they are. The next one is, what is a clade? We talk about this as well. So for example, if you were to look at, let's say, let's use this picture as an example, this cladogram right here. What is a clade? A clade is a common ancestor and all of its descendants. So if you're thinking about descendants and one common ancestor and all of its descendants, that's a clade. So for example, over here, A and B, if I draw a circle right here, this will be a clade because we have the common ancestor right here, and we have all of its descendants, A and B. If I were to draw a circle around A, B, and C, that would not be a clade because A, B, and C have a common ancestor right here. But we have a common ancestor, but we don't have all of its descendants. We only have A, B, and C. This common ancestor have the descendants A, B, C, D, E. So if you draw a circle around A, B, and C, that is not a clade. If you draw a circle around C, D, and E, that is a clade because we have the common ancestor of C, D, and E right here, and all of the descendants, that's C, D, and E. Okay. What is a common ancestor? How do you find a common ancestor? If you don't remember, we already talked about this in class. Let's say you want to find the common ancestor of A and B, you kind of trace back and see where the two lines meet. So over here, C and E's common ancestor, if you trace it back, it meets right here. What would be the common ancestor of A and D? So if you trace it back this way, D trace back this way, it meets right here. So this is a common ancestor for all of these organisms right here. Okay. If you were to draw a timeline showing the past to recent, this will be the past, where the root of the tree is. That's the past. And this is recent. Okay. Let's see. I answered all these questions. When you see a cladogram, it's really important for you to draw a timeline. I think that's a good practice. If you have not gotten every single one of the cladogram questions right, I will strongly encourage you. I can't require you to do anything, but I strongly encourage you to draw a timeline. Even if the cladogram seems easy, drawing a timeline will make it more easy. It'll make it easier for you to tell where the common ancestor is and where the most recent common ancestor is. So for example, I drew a timeline right here. If you look at the common ancestor, this one, and this one. If I were to ask you A, B, and C, which common ancestor, well, let's say 1, 2, and 3, which common ancestor is the most recent common ancestor? It would be this one, because if you were to draw a dotted line from that to the timeline, this one is the most recent. So this is now I apologize for my bad artwork from clicking on the trackpad. And this will be the oldest, the most ancient common ancestor. So all 5 of these species are, none of these is more ancient than another. A and B and C and D and E are all alive right now. The only species that are ancestors are these common ancestors. This one, this one, this one, and here's one more common ancestor. Okay. Which part of the cladogram, let's see. Next one says, which part of the cladogram indicates a common ancestor? Which part of the cladogram indicates a common ancestor? From this picture, you can have a common ancestor right here. This is also where the speciation event happens. The word speciation means the formation of 2 different species from the same common ancestor. So we have a common ancestor. This is some ancient organism, and this common ancestor is able to diverge into B and C. So this is also, this node right here, we call it a node. This node is also where the speciation event happens. This is also where the common ancestor of B and C is located. Be able to identify a common ancestor and list all the descendants. For example, this is the common ancestor. What are all the descendants? A, B, and C. Well, let's look at more examples that are a little more complicated in a little bit as well. So that, because you'll see a lot of cladograms on the test, and I want you to be able to feel very confident and answer all those questions right. The next one, I think I answered all these. Oh, okay. The relationship. So this B and C, because they share a common ancestor right here, B and C are equally as related to the common ancestor. Okay, because that's where they diverged from. That means they're equally as related to the common ancestor. It's like thinking you and your brother or sister, both of you are equally as related to your parents. You both came from your parents, right? The next one is, let's say the common ancestor of A, B, and C is over here. The relationship between B and A is the same as C and A because B and A have a common ancestor right here. C and A also has a common ancestor right here. So this is like saying, say this is you, this is your brother, this is your parents, and this one is your grandmother, and this one would be your cousin, for example. Your cousin, you and your brother are all equally as related to the grandma. So try to make sure that you understand how this works. This little paragraph over here, if you didn't quite understand what I was saying, read this over one more time. If you don't really know what it means, make sure you see me before the test tomorrow. Next one, how do you identify which species is most closely related to a certain species asked? So, question for you. Which species is most closely related to A? The answer will be B because they both have a most recent common ancestor shared right here. Which species is most closely related to C? You can say D and E because C, D, and E all share a most recent common ancestor right here. So C and D is equally as related compared to C and E. What is the most recent common ancestor? Oh wait, which species is most closely related to D? That would be E because D and E share a most recent common ancestor right here. What would be? Well, if I were to ask you, is A more closely related to D compared to A and E? Think about that for a second. The answer would also be no, because A and D share a most recent common ancestor right here, and A and E share a most recent common ancestor right here. So first you need to be able to find where the common ancestor is, and if 2 organisms share the same common ancestor, 3 different species share the same common ancestor, that means the 3 are related, right? If A and D share the most recent common ancestor right here, and A and E also shares it right here, that means A and D's relationship is the same as A and E. Okay? See, which one of the following is most closely related to D? Out of all three of these answers, the answer will be C. This one with which species does C share a most recent common ancestor? C and A share a most recent common ancestor right here. C and D share a most recent common ancestor right here. So if you were to draw a timeline, like this common ancestor for A and C lands right here in the timeline, and A and D lands right here in the timeline. So this one is the more recent common ancestor, the most recent common ancestor. So the answer for this question will be A. Okay, so this one over here is wrong. That was from my college class. People got it wrong. So the next one, if a cladogram shows the development of a certain feature, let's see, let me move this down a little bit. If a cladogram shows the development of a certain feature, we call those the derived characteristic. So all of these are derived characteristics because those are derived later on. So for example, we have the common ancestor of all these species right here. Jaws is a derived characteristic that's developed after hagfish is evolved. So from this common ancestor, we send out two branches, one this way and one this way, right? So the hagfish branched out before jaws were able to develop, and jaws are only developed along this branch. So this common ancestor is evolving, and then at one point developed jaws. So this species and this common ancestor and all of the descendants of this common ancestor is going to have jaws unless something else, some other mutation happens. Okay? So all of these are called derived characteristics because they're derived after a speciation event happens. The next one is let's see. In general, the more derived characteristics two species share, the more recently they share a common ancestor and the more closely related they are in evolution. So for example, a chimp and a mouse look a lot more alike than a chimp and a lizard, and they share a lot of common they share a lot of common characteristics. That means genetically and evolutionarily, they're more closely related to each other than chimp to lizard. And you're able to see which organism have what type of characteristics. So for example, for jaws, because jaws is developed over here, all of these organisms have jaws. And then the perch, I guess that's a fish, branched out and evolved. And then on this side, the common ancestor right here for all of these species would all have lungs because the lungs was developed before all of these species are developed. And then the next one is claws or nails. All of these organisms, all these species would have claws or nails because this common ancestor was evolved after the claws or nails, this characteristic was derived. And then the next one will be feathers. Only the pigeon developed feathers. And then for fur, mammary glands, these two are developed before this common ancestor. So all the descendants of this common ancestor will have fur and mammary glands. So mouse and chimp both have fur and mammary gland. Please, please, please make sure you understand what I just talked about. If you're confused, you have to see me because this is going to be on the test. I think this is all just explaining what I just talked about, so you can look through this as well. Next one, you can tell the relatedness and common ancestry from the cladogram, right? So you can see a mouse and chimp share a most recent common ancestor right here, but you cannot tell which extant species are primitive or advanced. All of these species are extant species, meaning that they're not extinct. You can't say chimp is more advanced than hagfish, because chimp lives in its environment and it can live just fine, and hagfish can also live just fine. Chimp is not more advanced, And hagfish is not more primitive just because it was evolved earlier in the days, right? An example I thought of would be a computer and cell phone. Cell phones are invented later than computer. It's kind of like cell phones are invented over here, but computer wasn't invented until later on. That doesn't mean, oh wait, I got it backward. Rewind. Computers are invented earlier than cell phones. So it's like computers emerged right here, but cell phone didn't emerge until over here. This doesn't mean that computers are more advanced or is an ancestor to cell phone, because they're completely two different things, right? They are equally as advanced to the extent of what they do. They're doing different things. So if you're comparing hagfish to chimp, they are doing different things in their environment, and as long as they're fit for the environment, one is not an ancestor or more primitive or advanced to the other, or older or younger. This ancestor right here is more older, or an ancestor to all of these organisms, but all of these organisms is not an ancestor to any of it. Okay, simple or complex, or more or less evolved. So just make sure you remember what is an evolution, what you can actually tell from a cladogram, and what you cannot tell. This one is saying that if a branch on a cladogram reaches the end, so all of these species are at the tip of the tree, so that means all of these are extant species, I'm sorry. That means they're all present, they're alive. But if you have one of these branches cut short over here, for example, that means that species went extinct. Okay, so if you look at this picture right here, we have all of these mammals. These ones are all extant species. They're alive right now. All of these went extinct. Okay, and yeah, that's it. So as you can see, these are all mammals. So whales are all actually more closely related to hippopotamus than whale to fish, because fish is not a mammal. Here are just some examples of other types of cladograms that you might see. You can use it as a practice. So I can do a few examples with you and show you how you can use this to practice. First off, draw a timeline. A question that you can ask yourself is, which two species are most closely related to each other? A and B and D and E can both be the answer to this one, because their common ancestor all land on the same point on the timeline. If I were to ask you what is the most closely related species is to C on here, the answer will be D or E, because C and D share a most recent common ancestor right here. E and C also share a most recent common ancestor right here. You can't answer A and B, because A and B and C share a most recent common ancestor right here. And this common ancestor is more ancient than this common ancestor. So this tells you that C and D, or C and E, are more related, more closely related than C to B or C to A. So bottom line is, if two organisms share a most recent common ancestor, that means those two, or two species, those two species are more closely related to each other. Here's another example. Draw a timeline. You can see that C and D share a most recent common ancestor right here. C, D, and D share a most recent common ancestor right here. A and B share a most recent common ancestor right here. So C and B, if you trace all the way back, C and B will share a most recent common ancestor right here. E and B share a most recent common ancestor right here. So what are the two, what species are the most closely related to each other? A and B are most closely related to each other, and C and D are most closely related to each other as well, because all of their common ancestor land right here. That's pretty much it. You can use this as an example for clades as well. This is a clade, because we have a common ancestor in all of its descendants. This is not a clade, because we have these three species, and if you look at their common ancestor, it goes all the way back here. There are two problems. You didn't include the common ancestor in this circle, and you also didn't include all of the descendants of the common ancestor. So this is not a clade. This is getting a little messy. This is also not a clade because D, A, E share a most recent common ancestor right here, but you didn't include C. If you do this, this is a clade. So you can ask each other, you can find a friend and ask each other some questions based on these other cladograms as well. No matter how the cladogram is drawn, you should be able to tell the relationships between the different species pretty easily. And when you see something more complicated like this, you don't get overwhelmed. Just look at one thing at a time. Look at A. If you're asking about A and C, find C and see where the common ancestor is. So I'm going the next one. We have three more things to go through. What is the difference between relative dating and radiometric dating? Relative dating is when you use fossils to tell the relative age of a fossil. You can tell which fossil is older than the other fossil, but you can't tell how old exactly is that fossil. How do scientists use fossil record as an evidence for evolution? You can use fossil record because you can use it to date fossils. That's one example. You can also look at the structures of the fossil to tell relatively which species could be closely related to another species, but just only based on the bone structure. You can also use fossils to come up with some ideas on the environment that this species lived in. That's it. So using fossil is sometimes not as reliable as using DNA evidence, but combining DNA evidence and fossil and embryological evidence, all of that, and so on, all of those is able to help you come up with the best, the most accurate cladogram that you can, but it doesn't necessarily mean that a cladogram is complete. You might find evidence later on that tell you something different. Okay. There's one more thing that I forgot to write on here was half-life. You need to know what a half-life is. A half-life is used during radiometric dating. For example, you can have carbon-14. Right here. Carbon-14 is radioactive, and carbon-14 can be turned into nitrogen-14. When you die, all the carbon-14, let's say there's 100% of carbon-14. That's the initial amount. After 5,730 years, you don't need to know this number, but after 5,730 years, the carbon-14 level is going to be cut to half. So if you start with 100% of carbon-14, after 7,030 years, there's only going to be 50%. After another 5,730 years, there's only going to be 25% of the carbon-14. So what a half-life is the amount of time that it takes for the radioactive element to cut its amount to half of the original amount. So in this case, the 5,730 years is the half-life for carbon-14. So make sure you understand that. Carbon-14 has a relatively long half-life, but there are also other elements that have longer half-lives. There could be ones that take 10,000 years before the radioactive element gets cut into half of the amount. So if you have a fossil that's really, really, really old and you want to know the beginning of life, when was that? You might need to use a fossil. Well, you might need to use a radioactive element that's not carbon-14. You need something that has a longer half-life. On the other hand, when you're dating a fossil, usually you won't want to use a half-life that's only, let's say, 30 years, because you won't be able to trace back very much, because it's only 30 years, 60 years, 90 years. It takes a long time to get into the thousands. The next one is divergent evolution and convergent evolution. I hope you kind of understand what I talk about in class today, but if you didn't, there are two, make sure you watch these two videos one more time. Where'd it go? Oh, here it is. This video link needs to be updated. I'll update that in a little bit. watch this video. It tells you about convergent and divergent evolution. And then make sure you also watch this video right here. This one tells you about coevolution, which is also going to be on the test. Let's talk about this real quick. Divergent evolution is when you have a common ancestor and two species are formed from the same common ancestor. And these two species will have certain bone structures and DNA as well, but it's hard, you can't really see that, that are similar to each other as well as the common ancestor. So for example, all of these different species came from the same common ancestor. How about this one? All three of these species came from the same common ancestor, and so they all have a vertebrae, right? So the formation of vertebrae is an example of divergent evolution because all three of these species diverged from the same common ancestor. So whatever characteristics that this common ancestor has, the vertebrae, for example, the tripartite brain, all of these descendants is going to have that. So all three of these species have a vertebrae because the common ancestor had a vertebrae. We call this a divergent evolution, and we can also call the vertebrae itself a homologous structure. A convergent evolution is basically, for divergent evolution, is when you're drawing clade. It's kind of similar to that. A convergent evolution is when you're drawing not a clade. So for example, if we have shark and dolphin have similar streamlined body structure on the outside, and however, shark has gills and no lungs. Dolphin does not have a gill, and it has to breathe in oxygen from the air, and it has a lung. But they also both have flippers. So if you're talking about the development of the streamlined body shape of shark and dolphin, that's a result of convergent evolution. Okay? We call it convergent evolution because the dolphin developed its streamlined body shape because it had to live in the water. Shark also had to develop its body shape because it had to live in the water. But they developed these two body structures not because their common ancestor, which is right here, the vertebrae, not because the common ancestor was able to swim and have the streamlined body structure, is because they had to adapt to the environment on their own, and then they developed those characteristics on their own. So that is not an example of common ancestry. On the other hand, this picture, we didn't get to talk about it in class, but let me talk about it real quick over here. We have two types of flying squirrels, but one of them is a marsupial, meaning it has pouches. Okay, one of them is a placental animal, which means they have placenta. They both look like flying squirrels, and they can fly between trees, and it's pretty funny. However, their development, their ability to fly between trees did not develop because the common ancestor, which is right here, has the ability to fly. They developed their ability to fly on their own. It's not due to common ancestry. Okay. However, if you're comparing their structure of having canine teeth, that is so earlier, being able to fly, we will call that convergent evolution because they developed those ability and body structure and function on their own and not due to common ancestry. The other one, let's say if we're talking about the canine teeth between these two, we would call that divergent evolution because they all diverged from the same common ancestor, and they have a canine teeth because the common ancestor had the canine teeth. In this example, it's showing you a similar thing. All of these organisms are around the earth, and they kind of look similar, and they all eat ants. We call this a convergent evolution because they're not able to eat ants because their common ancestor is able to eat ants. They're able to eat ants because they develop those adaptations on their own in their own environment, but the environment is similar in these areas for these organisms. So we call that convergent evolution. So again, divergent evolution result in species having similar characteristics due to common ancestry. So if this species and this species share a similar characteristic, such as bone structure, and the common ancestor also have the same bone structure, this is divergent evolution. Okay? Another example for convergent evolution will be the butterfly wings and the bird's wings. They both are wings, but one is an insect, one is a bird. And they develop those characteristics because of their specific adaptation to the environment, not because they came from a very recent common ancestor. The last one is coevolution, so make sure you watch this video. But what this is showing you over here is this flower right here, or right here. This flower wants, quote unquote, wants a pollen to be spread only to flowers of the same species. So if it's like a regular flower where the pollen is right on top of the flower, then any pollinator is able to spread those pollen. And as this pollen tube is changing, these flies is also changing its mouse part. Okay, the reason for that is because if the pollen is moving backward a lot, this fly also has to extend its mouse part in order to get the pollen. So we call this coevolution because this flower for this plant, as well as this fly is evolving simultaneously. They're evolving at the same time. So this is an example of coevolution.